January 5, 1943. The waters off Guadalcanal shimmered under a dawn sky split between hope and dread. Aboard the light cruiser USS Helena, Lieutenant Red Cochrane stood at his post commanding the aft 5-inch battery. His hands moved across the gun director with practiced ease, but his mind carried a burden few men on that ship understood. Loaded into the breeches of his guns were shells unlike any fired in combat before. Inside each steel casing, smaller than a man's fist, pulsed a secret so profound that even Cochrane had been told only enough to use it, never to understand it. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning had been quiet. Too quiet. Then, through the scattered clouds, they came. 4 Aichi-D, 3A dive bombers, their fixed landing gear hanging like talons, their engines screaming as they plunged toward the task force. The Japanese called them Type 99 carrier bombers. The Allies called them Vals, obsolete yet still deadly in the hands of pilots willing to press their attacks to the point of no return. One Val struck the New Zealand cruiser Achilles before the formation began to break away, satisfied with the chaos they had sown. Cochrane's crew watched the retreating bombers. Standard doctrine said to let them go. Anti-aircraft fire at that range with conventional ammunition was a waste of shells. The odds of hitting a maneuvering aircraft were less than 1 in 10,000. Yet Cochrane received the order to fire. 2 salvos, 6 shells. The first salvo streaked skyward, and then something impossible happened. The Val erupted into flames without any shell visibly striking it. The aircraft tumbled, trailing smoke and fire, and crashed into the sea. Cochrane's men stared in disbelief. Japanese observers watching from distant positions reported the engagement with confusion. American gunfire had somehow reached out and swatted an aircraft from the sky without direct contact. It defied everything they understood about naval warfare. What neither side fully grasped in that moment was that the balance of the Pacific War had just shifted. The weapon that destroyed that Val was not the shell itself, but the invisible hand inside it, a miniature radio transmitter and receiver that had sensed the aircraft's proximity and detonated at precisely the right moment. The Japanese would spend the next 2 years trying to comprehend what had just happened. By then, it would be far too late. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In the autumn of 1942, Japanese naval planners reviewed intelligence reports with a mixture of confidence and caution. Their carrier strike forces had suffered devastating losses at Midway and the Coral Sea, yet their belief in ultimate victory remained unshaken. American anti-aircraft defenses, while improving, still operated within predictable limits. Gunnery officers aboard Japanese warships understood the mathematics of interception. A 5-inch shell fired at an aircraft traveling 300 miles per hour had to be timed with near perfection to explode at the exact altitude and moment the target crossed its path. The standard American time fuse required gunners to estimate the aircraft's speed, altitude, and trajectory, then set the fuse to detonate at a predetermined time after firing. Even with radar-controlled gun directors, the margin for error was razor-thin. Japanese tactical doctrine exploited this weakness. Pilots learned to vary their altitude and speed during attacks, making fuse settings nearly impossible to predict. The result was a brutal calculus. American ships fired thousands of shells to bring down a handful of attackers, and even then, many Japanese aircraft reached their targets. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had recognized this vulnerability, but had been killed in April 1943 before he could fully exploit it. His successor, Admiral Minachi Koga, inherited a strategy that depended on massed air attacks overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers. If the Americans could only stop 1 in every several hundred shells fired, then the path to victory lay in launching waves of aircraft faster than the defenders could reload their guns. Yet in the laboratories of Johns Hopkins University and the factories of Crosley Corporation, American scientists and engineers were solving a problem that Japanese planners believed unsolvable. The proximity fuse, or VT fuse as it was deceptively named, stood on the edge of transforming aerial warfare. Its development had begun in 1940 under the auspices of the National Defense Research Committee. The challenge was staggering. Create a device small enough to fit inside the nose of an artillery shell, make it rugged enough to survive the shock of being fired from a gun, a force exceeding 20,000 times the pull of gravity, ensure it could emit a radio signal, detect the reflection from a nearby aircraft, and detonate the explosive charge at precisely the right distance, and do all of this with components so miniature that they had never been manufactured at scale. Dr. Merle Tuve, director of the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, led a team that worked in obsessive secrecy. They faced failures that would have broken lesser men, vacuum tubes shattered under the acceleration of test firings, batteries died in storage, circuits collapsed under the centrifugal forces of a spinning shell. Over 30 different designs were tested and abandoned, yet by the summer of 1942 they had succeeded. On August 12, 1942, the newly commissioned cruiser USS Cleveland conducted live-fire trials in Chesapeake Bay. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drones, maneuvering to evade the ship's fire. The gunners fired just 4 shells, equipped with proximity fuzzes. All 3 drones were destroyed on the first day. The Navy cancelled the remainder of the test and immediately ordered mass production. What made the VT fuse revolutionary was its simplicity married to precision. Each fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter powered by a battery that activated instantly upon firing. As the shell flew toward its target, it emitted a steady radio signal. When that signal bounced off a nearby object, an aircraft, a missile, anything metal, the reflected waves created interference. The fuse detected this interference, calculated the distance, and triggered the detonator when the target was within lethal range. The lethal fragment area of a proximity-fused shell was 50 times larger than a conventional time fuse. Where the old shells created a killing zone of roughly 60 square feet, the new ones blanketed 3,000 square feet with shrapnel. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrews would prove as devastating as the physical destruction. Pilots who had learned to exploit the limitations of time fuses suddenly found themselves flying through an invisible web of death. Shells that missed by dozens of feet still destroyed their aircraft. Evasive maneuvers that once guaranteed survival became meaningless against a weapon that did not need a direct hit to kill. By January 1943, when Lieutenant Cochrane's guns downed that Val off Guadalcanal, fewer than 5,000 proximity fuses had been manufactured. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Forces, had received the first shipment with explicit instructions. Use them sparingly, guard the secret with absolute discipline. If a fuzzed shell landed intact on enemy-held territory, the technology could be reverse-engineered. The risk was acceptable only because the waters around Guadalcanal were deep, and any duds would sink beyond recovery. Cochrane and his fellow gun crews were told only that they were firing a new type of shell with improved reliability. They were not told how it worked, only that it would increase their hit probability. The results spoke for themselves. Within weeks of the Helena's first combat use, other ships began reporting similar successes. Japanese aircraft that approached American task forces found themselves facing a storm of airbursts that seemed to anticipate their movements. Captured Japanese records from this period reveal a growing confusion. Pilots reported that American anti-aircraft fire had become uncannily accurate. Shells exploded near their aircraft even when they were certain no direct hit had occurred. Intelligence officers speculated about improved radar, better training, or simply the overwhelming volume of American firepower. None guessed the truth. The Americans had invented a shell that thought for itself. By March 1943, the effectiveness of proximity-fused ammunition had become undeniable. In the Solomon Islands campaign, Admiral Halsey's task forces came under repeated night attacks by Mitsubishi G-4M twin-engine bombers, which the Allies called Bettys. These attacks had been devastating in the past, with torpedoes launched under cover of darkness, finding their targets with deadly regularity. But now, American ships equipped with proximity fuses and radar-controlled gun directors turned the night into a killing field for Japanese aircraft. The numbers told a story that Japanese commanders struggled to explain. In 1943, American naval guns fired 36,370 anti-aircraft rounds. Only 25% of those shells used proximity fuses, yet those fused shells accounted for 51% of all aircraft shot down. The new ammunition was 300% more effective than conventional time fuses. By 1945, as production ramped up and more ships received the advancing shells, effectiveness would rise to nearly 600%, even though roughly 30% of proximity fuses were duds that failed to detonate. The sensory reality of these engagements burned into the memories of men on both sides. American sailors described the sharp crack of 5-inch guns firing in rapid succession, the brilliant flash of shells detonating in mid-air, and the spectacular sight of enemy aircraft disintegrating in balls of flame. Japanese pilots who survived these encounters spoke of flying through walls of exploding steel, of watching wingmen vanish in sudden fireballs, of the terror of facing a defense that seemed impossible to evade. One Japanese pilot, interviewed after the war, described it as fighting against an invisible enemy that struck from every direction at once. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers in the Solomon Islands, later reflected on the transformation. Mechanical time fuses, he recalled, only brought down aircraft by accident at night. They were good for harassing enemy planes, but that was about all. The proximity fuse changed everything. Suddenly, night attacks became suicidal for the Japanese. Ships without air cover, once sitting ducks, could defend themselves with devastating effectiveness. The Pacific Theater in early 1943 was a vast chessboard where every move carried the weight of national survival. The Japanese Empire, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, relied on its naval aviation to project power and defend its island strongholds. American forces, advancing island by island, depended on their carriers and surface fleets to support amphibious operations. The proximity fuse became the fulcrum on which this balance tipped, yet the full impact of this technology would not become apparent until the summer of 1944, when the largest carrier battle in history would test every assumption about aerial warfare. At that moment, American gunners would discover whether their invisible weapon could withstand the fury of a desperate enemy willing to sacrifice everything for victory. And Japanese commanders would face a reality they had never imagined. That American industrial might, married to scientific innovation, had created a weapon against which courage and skill alone could not prevail. The spring of 1943 passed in a grinding campaign of attrition across the Solomon Islands. American forces pushed northward, capturing airfields and establishing supply bases, while Japanese defenders fought with a ferocity born of desperation. In the skies above these contested waters, a new pattern emerged. Ships equipped with proximity-fused shells consistently repelled air attacks with far lower expenditure of ammunition. Pilots returning from missions reported that American anti-aircraft fire had become lethal at ranges previously considered safe. Japanese naval intelligence compiled reports that grew increasingly alarmed. One analysis from mid-1943 noted that American ships were achieving hit rates that exceeded theoretical maximums. The document speculated about new radar technology or improved fire control systems, but the truth remained hidden. The Americans had not merely improved existing technology, they had fundamentally changed the nature of anti-aircraft warfare. In the United States, production of proximity fuses accelerated with the relentless efficiency that characterized American industry. Crosley Corporation, Western Electric, General Electric, Raytheon, and dozens of subcontractors turned out fuses by the tens of thousands. By late 1943, production reached 40,000 units per day. Each fuse cost just $18 to manufacture, down from the initial $732 per unit in the early stages of development. What had begun as a scientific marvel became an industrial commodity, crated and shipped across oceans to every fleet and task force in the Pacific. The technological edge extended beyond mere numbers. The miniature vacuum tubes inside each fuse, modified from hearing aid components, could withstand not only the shock of firing, but also the centrifugal forces of a shell spinning at 30,000 revolutions per minute. The batteries activated instantly upon firing and remained functional for the duration of the shell's flight. The radio transmitter operated on a frequency that penetrated rain, clouds, and darkness, making the fuse equally effective in any weather condition. This was precision engineering on a scale that Japanese industry, even at its peak, could not replicate. As summer turned to autumn in 1943, American naval planners began to look ahead to the next phase of the Pacific Campaign. The Central Pacific Offensive, aimed at the Mariana Islands, would bring American forces within strategic bombing range of the Japanese home islands. The operation would require massive carrier task forces operating deep in enemy-controlled waters, exposed to attack from land-based and carrier aircraft. The success or failure of these operations would depend, in large part, on the ability of American ships to defend themselves against massed air attacks. The proximity fuse, still a closely guarded secret, would be tested as never before. By December 1943, the VT fuse had proven itself in dozens of engagements across the South Pacific, yet the Japanese remained ignorant of its existence. Captured equipment and intelligence reports mentioned improved American gunnery, but nothing pointed to a revolutionary new weapon. This blindness would prove catastrophic. Japanese war planning for 1944 assumed that American anti-aircraft defenses operated within known parameters. They calculated that sufficient numbers of aircraft, properly coordinated, could overwhelm any task force. They were about to discover how profoundly wrong they were. The opening months of 1944 brought a series of American victories in the Marshall Islands. Task forces, equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, sailed into heavily defended waters and emerged with minimal losses. Japanese air attacks that should have inflicted crippling damage instead resulted in heavy Japanese casualties and negligible American losses. Observers noted that American ships seemed almost invulnerable to air attack, a perception that would grow stronger as the year progressed. In the factories of Japan, engineers worked frantically to develop their own proximity fuse. Over 30 different designs were sketched, tested, and abandoned. They experimented with acoustic fuses triggered by engine sounds, electrostatic fuses based on field effects, and radio fuses similar to the American design. Every attempt failed. The vacuum tubes shattered. The circuits collapsed. The batteries died. Japanese scientists concluded that a functional proximity fuse was either impossible or required manufacturing capabilities beyond their reach. They were half right. It was beyond their reach, but the Americans had already solved the problem. April 1944 arrived with the inevitability of a storm gathering on the horizon. American forces prepared to invade Saipan in the Mariana Islands, an operation that would bring the war to Japan's doorstep. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, issued orders for Operation Eigo, the decisive naval battle that Japanese strategy had anticipated for years. Every available carrier, battleship, and cruiser was mobilized. The first mobile fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, assembled a force of 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and dozens of support vessels. The plan was audacious: use land-based aircraft from the Marianas to strike American forces, then launch carrier air groups in coordinated waves that would overwhelm the enemy through sheer numbers. Japanese confidence rested on assumptions that seemed reasonable. American carriers could launch roughly 900 aircraft. Japanese forces could muster over 800 carrier-based planes, plus several hundred land-based aircraft. The mathematics suggested a roughly equal contest, one where Japanese pilot skill and tactical coordination could tip the balance. What Japanese planners did not know, could not know, was that the contest had already been decided by a weapon they did not believe existed. On June 6, 1944, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher led Task Force 58 out of Majuro Harbor in the Marshall Islands. The armada stretched to the horizon: 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Every ship bristled with 5-inch guns loaded with proximity-fused shells. The ships carried over 890 aircraft, but their true defensive power lay not in fighters but in the invisible barrier created by thousands of shells that could kill without hitting their targets. Mitcher's pilots began operations on June 11th, with a fighter sweep against Japanese airfields in the Marianas. Over 3 days, American aircraft claimed over 100 Japanese planes destroyed in the air and on the ground. By the time American troops began landing on Saipan on June 15th, Japanese air power in the Marianas had been severely diminished. Admiral Toyoda activated Operation A-Go, committing the combined fleet to a battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true power of American technological supremacy. Japanese pilots, many of them inexperienced replacements for the veterans lost in earlier battles, would fly into a storm of fire unlike anything seen before in naval warfare. The proximity fuse, secret weapon of the Pacific, was about to write its name into history in letters of flame and steel. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. June 19th, 1944 dawned over the Philippine Sea with deceptive calm. Aboard the carriers of Task Force 58, pilots gathered for briefings while gunners checked their ammunition stores. The air smelled of salt spray, aviation fuel, and the metallic tang of freshly oiled machinery. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher stood on the bridge of his flagship, the carrier Lexington, studying radar plots that showed Japanese aircraft formations approaching from the west. This was the moment American forces had prepared for, the decisive carrier battle that would determine control of the Pacific. At 07:30, radar operators detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft, 70 planes, launched from Admiral Ozawa's carriers, flying in tight formation toward the American fleet. Mitcher ordered his fighters airborne. Grumman F-6F Hellcats, tough and powerful, climbed to meet the threat. But the real defense lay with the ships themselves. Every cruiser and destroyer positioned itself to create overlapping fields of fire. Gun crews loaded shells with practiced speed. Most were proximity-fosed, each one a miniature marvel of American engineering. The Japanese pilots, many of them young and barely trained, flew into what they expected to be a conventional battle. They had been briefed on American defensive tactics, told that fighter interception would be their primary threat, and that ships would fire predictable barrages of time-fosed shells. What they encountered instead was something beyond their comprehension. The first shells exploded at 08:15, not after reaching a predetermined altitude, but at the exact moment they passed near Japanese aircraft. Pilots saw their wingmen disintegrate in mid-flight, hit by shrapnel from shells that never touched their planes. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu, flying with Fighting Squadron 16, watched from above as the spectacle unfolded, the sky filled with black puffs of smoke, each one marking a proximity-fosed shell detonating near its target. Japanese formations broke apart under the onslaught. Aircraft spun out of control, trailing smoke and flame. Vrasiu and his fellow pilots pressed their attacks, but they realized quickly that the ships below were doing much of the work for them. The combination of fighter interception and proximity-fosed anti-aircraft fire created a killing zone that few Japanese aircraft could penetrate. From the Japanese perspective, the attack was a nightmare. Pilots radioed desperate warnings. American fire was impossibly accurate. Shells exploded near aircraft that were maneuvering evasively. Traditional tactics, varying altitude and speed to confuse fire control, proved useless. The invisible hand of the proximity fuse reached out and swatted planes from the sky with mechanical precision. Of the 70 aircraft in the first wave, fewer than 30 survived long enough to approach their targets. Most dropped their bombs or torpedoes early and fled. None hit an American carrier. The second wave attacked at 0900. 128 aircraft, a mix of dive bombers and torpedo planes, approached from multiple directions. Ozawa had ordered his pilots to press home their attacks, to accept losses in exchange for crippling strikes against American carriers. The pilots obeyed with courage, born of desperation. They dove through curtains of anti-aircraft fire, their aircraft shuddering under the impact of shrapnel. Ships fired in salvos, the 5-inch guns roaring in coordinated rhythm. The shells climbed skyward, their proximity fuzzes armed and active. At altitudes between 10,000 and 20,000 feet, they began to detonate. Observers aboard American ships described the scene as surreal. Japanese aircraft seemed to fly into invisible walls. Shells burst in perfect spheres of shrapnel, each explosion timed to catch aircraft at maximum vulnerability. The lethality was mathematical, precise, utterly devoid of mercy. Pilots who had trained for months, who carried photos of families and sweethearts, vanished in seconds. Their aircraft broke apart, engines seized, wings folded, and bodies fell into the sea far below. Of the 128 aircraft in the second wave, 97 were destroyed. The remainder scattered, their missions unaccomplished. Admiral Ozawa, monitoring reports from his flagship Taiho, struggled to comprehend what was happening. His carefully planned coordinated strikes were disintegrating before reaching their targets. Loss rates exceeded 50% in some formations. Pilots radioed confusion and fear. American defenses were impenetrable. Fire was impossibly accurate. Something was wrong, fundamentally and catastrophically wrong. Yet Ozawa pressed forward. He launched a third wave at 1000 hours. 47 aircraft, mostly fighters and dive bombers, with orders to focus on American carriers at all costs. The third wave met the same fate as its predecessors. American fighters, guided by radar and coordinated through combat information centers, intercepted many before they reached the fleet. Those that broke through encountered the proximity fuze barrier. Shells exploded in clusters, creating overlapping kill zones. Aircraft damaged by near misses lost control and plunged into the ocean. Pilots who survived the gauntlet of fire often found their aircraft too damaged to return to their carriers. They ditched in open water, hoping for rescue that would never come. Of the 47 aircraft in the third wave, only 12 survived. By noon, Admiral Ozawa had launched a fourth wave. 82 aircraft, the last reserves of his carrier air groups, flew east with grim determination. Japanese doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, the single engagement that would turn the tide of war. Ozawa had to believe, that sufficient numbers of aircraft could overwhelm any defense. The mathematics said so, the tradition demanded it. But mathematics and tradition meant nothing against a weapon that turned probability into certainty. The fourth wave suffered even higher losses than the previous attacks. American gunners, now confident in their ammunition, fired with aggressive precision. Proximity-fused shells created a barrier that resembled a solid wall of fire. Japanese pilots, witnessing the destruction of their comrades, began to break formation and flee. Discipline, the cornerstone of Japanese naval aviation, collapsed under the sheer terror of facing an enemy that killed with invisible hands. Of the 82 aircraft in the fourth wave, 70 were destroyed. The remainder returned to their carriers with tales of impossible American firepower and invincible defenses. American sailors, watching the slaughter, coined a phrase that would define the battle: the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. It was not said with malice, but with a sense of awe at the technological superiority they had witnessed. Japanese aircraft fell from the sky like birds shot at a country fair, their maneuvers futile against weapons that did not miss. Admiral Arleigh Burke, observing from his command position, later recalled the visceral impact of the battle. Every burst of anti-aircraft fire seemed to find a target. The proximity fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. Without those fuses, Burke reflected, ship losses and casualties would have been enormously larger. The fast carrier task forces in the last half of the war would have suffered devastating attrition. Instead, American losses on June 19th were minimal. Fewer than 25 Hellcats lost in air-to-air combat, no carriers damaged, no capital ships hit. Against this, the Japanese lost 346 carrier aircraft in a single day. The sensory details of that day remained etched in memory. The thunder of guns, the acrid smell of cordite, the sight of burning aircraft spiraling into the sea, the cheers of sailors as another enemy plane disintegrated. But beneath the celebration lay a recognition that something fundamental had changed. This was not victory achieved through superior skill or courage. This was victory delivered by industrial capacity and scientific innovation. The proximity fuse had transformed American ships into nearly invincible platforms, capable of destroying any aerial threat before it could strike. As evening fell on June 19th, Admiral Ozawa faced the ruins of his air groups. Over 400 aircraft lost, most of them carrier-based planes that represented years of training and irreplaceable expertise. His carriers remained afloat, but without aircraft, they were useless. The decisive battle he had sought had indeed occurred, but not as he had imagined. The Americans had not merely defeated his forces, they had annihilated them with a casualness that suggested overwhelming technological superiority. Ozawa withdrew westward, hoping to preserve his remaining ships for future operations. But the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to conduct large-scale carrier operations had ended. The following day, June 20th, American forces pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. In a controversial decision, Admiral Mitcher launched a long-range strike at maximum distance, knowing that many aircraft would run out of fuel before returning. The strike damaged several Japanese carriers and sank the carrier Hio, but the cost was high. Over 80 American aircraft were lost, most due to fuel exhaustion rather than enemy action. Pilots ditched in the darkness, hoping for rescue. Many were saved, testament to American emphasis on search and rescue operations. Yet the losses highlighted a paradox. American technology could protect ships from air attack with near certainty, but it could not yet extend operational ranges beyond the limits of aircraft fuel capacity. In the weeks following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American intelligence analyzed the engagement with clinical precision. Statistical reports confirmed what observers had witnessed. Proximity-fused shells accounted for over half of all aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire, despite representing only 75% of ammunition expended. The kill ratio was staggering. For every shell fired with a proximity fuse, the likelihood of destroying an enemy aircraft was roughly 300% higher than with conventional ammunition. By 1945, as fuse reliability improved, that figure would rise to nearly 600%. Japanese forces, reeling from the defeat, struggled to understand what had happened. Intelligence officers compiled reports from surviving pilots. The descriptions were consistent. American shells exploded near aircraft without direct hits. Evasive maneuvers proved ineffective. The volume of anti-aircraft fire seemed impossibly lethal. Some officers speculated about improved radar or new fire control systems. Others suggested that American gunners had achieved superhuman levels of training. None guessed the existence of the proximity fuse. The technology seemed too advanced, too far beyond contemporary capabilities to be real. In fact, Japanese engineers had captured examples of proximity-fused shells during earlier engagements. Duds that failed to detonate had been recovered from battlefields and sent to technical laboratories for analysis. Researchers examined the miniature components, the vacuum tubes, the battery systems, the radio circuits. They documented everything meticulously. Then they filed the reports and moved on, dismissing the technology as either too complex to replicate or not worth the effort. This blindness was not stupidity, but a failure of imagination. Japanese military culture, focused on spirit and courage, could not fully embrace the idea that material superiority could decide battles regardless of human factors. American industrial output, meanwhile, continued to accelerate. By mid-1944, production of proximity fuses reached 70,000 units per day. Over 22 million fuses were manufactured by war's end, distributed across every theater of operations. The technology spread beyond naval anti-aircraft use. Army artillery units received proximity-fused shells for use against ground targets. In the European theater, during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, American forces used VT-fused artillery shells to devastating effect. The shells exploded above German troop concentrations, showering them with shrapnel that conventional ground-burst shells could not match. General George Patton, witnessing the carnage, wrote that the proximity fuse was devastating and would require a complete revision of land warfare tactics. Yet it was in the Pacific that the proximity fuse achieved its most profound impact. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had demonstrated that American carriers, protected by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, could operate with near impunity in Japanese-controlled waters. This realization reshaped Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. Amphibious landings could be conducted with carrier air support, knowing that Japanese air counterattacks would be blunted before reaching the fleet. Strategic bombing campaigns could be launched from island bases, with carrier task forces providing mobile defense against Japanese air forces. The path to Japan's home islands, once fraught with danger, had become a highway paved with American technological superiority. Japanese commanders, recognizing that conventional air attacks had become suicidal, turned to increasingly desperate measures. The kamikaze, suicide attacks where pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into ships, emerged as a tactical response to American defenses. If proximity fuzzes made it impossible to approach and drop bombs, then pilots would become the bombs themselves. The logic was brutal but undeniable. A determined pilot pressing an attack to impact could not be stopped by shells that detonated nearby. The aircraft might be damaged, even destroyed, but momentum would carry it forward. This tactic, born of desperation, would claim thousands of American lives in the final year of the war. Yet even the kamikaze could not overcome the fundamental equation that the proximity fuse had established. American ships could generate such dense fields of anti-aircraft fire that most kamikaze attacks were intercepted before reaching their targets. The success rate of kamikaze missions, while higher than conventional attacks, remained low enough that the tactic could not change the war's outcome. It could only make victory more costly for both sides. The proximity fuse had closed the door on Japanese air power. What remained was a grinding campaign of attrition that ended only with atomic weapons and Soviet intervention. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, surveying the Pacific Campaign in 1945, offered a simple assessment. The proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without it, the westward push would have been slower, more costly, perhaps impossible. Ships would have been lost, tens of thousands more sailors would have died, and the timeline to victory would have stretched into an uncertain future. The fuse was not merely a tactical advantage, it was a strategic weapon that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. Admiral William Halsey, reflecting on the technology after the war, called it the difference between winning and losing in the critical campaigns of 1944 and 1945. The broader implications extended beyond military history. The proximity fuse represented a new kind of warfare, where industrial capacity and scientific innovation could trump traditional military virtues. Japanese forces fought with courage, discipline, and tactical skill honed over decades. Yet these qualities proved insufficient against an enemy that could field weapons of such sophistication that they seemed almost magical. The lesson was not lost on post-war military planners. Future conflicts would be won not by the side with the bravest soldiers, but by the side with the most advanced technology and the industrial base to produce it at scale. For the Japanese, the Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the beginning of the end. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned a month after the battle, forced out by a government that finally recognized the war was unwinnable. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who commanded battleships at the Philippine Sea, wrote poetry in his diary, expressing the despair of defeat. The superiority of American materiel, he noted, had overwhelmed Japanese spirit. It was a bitter admission for a culture that had staked everything on the belief that will and courage could overcome material disadvantage. The proximity fuse had proven that belief tragically wrong. In the final months of the war, as American forces prepared to invade Okinawa and potentially the Japanese home islands, the proximity fuse continued to save lives. At Okinawa, kamikaze attacks reached their peak intensity. Over 1,500 suicide missions were launched against American ships, yet the kill ratio remained heavily in favor of the defenders. Proximity-fuzzed shells created defensive barriers that destroyed most attackers before they reached their targets. The losses were still terrible. 21 ships sunk, 66 damaged, thousands of sailors killed or wounded. But without the proximity fuse, the casualties would have been catastrophically higher, perhaps enough to make the planned invasion of Japan seem unacceptably costly. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war. before that invasion became necessary. Yet historians have noted that the proximity fuse played an indirect role even in that final act. The security of the Marianas, guaranteed by American air superiority in the Philippine Sea, provided the basis from which B-29 bombers launched their strategic bombing campaigns. Those campaigns, culminating in the atomic strikes, would have been impossible if Japanese carriers had successfully disrupted American operations in June 1944. The proximity fuse, by ensuring American victory in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, made possible every subsequent operation that led to Japan's surrender. After the war ended, captured German and Japanese scientists were shown examples of American proximity fuses. Their reactions were uniformly ones of disbelief and grudging admiration. German engineers, who had attempted over 50 different designs without success, examined the miniature components with something approaching reverence. 10 years ahead of us, one muttered. Japanese researchers, who had dismissed the technology as impossible, recognized their error too late. The realization that they had been defeated not by courage or numbers, but by a device smaller than a fist, carried a sting that lingered long after the war's end. The human cost of the Pacific War defied simple accounting. Millions of soldiers and civilians died across Asia and the Pacific Islands. The proximity fuse, by shortening the war and reducing American casualties, indirectly saved lives on both sides. Yet it also represented a troubling evolution in warfare. The distance between killer and killed, already vast in naval combat, had grown even greater. Gunners fired shells that destroyed aircraft they could barely see, guided by electronic signals they did not understand. The pilots who died never knew what hit them, never saw the invisible hand that reached out and ended their lives. War had become a technical problem solved by engineers in laboratories, thousands of miles from the battlefield. The legacy of the proximity fuse extended far beyond World War II. The principles it embodied, miniaturization, automated target detection, remote detonation, became foundational to modern guided weapons. Surface-to-air missiles, smart bombs, and countless other systems trace their lineage to the VT fuse. The device that turned 5-inch naval guns into precision weapons in 1943 evolved into technologies that define contemporary warfare. The invisible hand that swatted Japanese aircraft from the sky in the Philippine Sea became the ancestor of weapons that can strike targets with meter-level accuracy from intercontinental distances. For the men who fought in the Pacific, the proximity fuse remained a source of quiet pride. They had not merely fought bravely, they had fought with the best weapons American industry could provide. The contrast with Japanese forces, increasingly desperate and under-equipped as the war progressed, highlighted the importance of industrial capacity in modern conflict. American factories, staffed by workers who would never see combat, contributed as much to victory as the sailors who manned the guns. The proximity fuse was their weapon, proof that free labor and democratic institutions could outproduce any totalitarian regime. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately a story about systems, not individual heroism, though there was plenty of that, not technological genius, though the engineering was brilliant, but the combination of scientific research, industrial production, military training, and strategic deployment that turned a laboratory curiosity into a war-winning weapon. The Japanese could have developed similar technology, their scientists were capable, their engineers skilled, but they lacked the integrated system that allowed the Americans to move from concept to mass production in less than 3 years. That system, as much as any individual component, was what won the war. As the sun set on June 19, 1944, sailors aboard American ships in the Philippine Sea celebrated a victory that many did not fully understand. They had fought bravely, yes, but their greatest ally had been a device they could not see, built by people they would never meet, based on principles most could not comprehend. The proximity fuse had turned their ships into fortresses, their guns into instruments of surgical precision. The Japanese, attacking with courage born of desperation, had flown into a storm they could not survive. And in that storm, the future of warfare had revealed itself, a future where technology, more than valor, would determine who lived and who died. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.